A very warm welcome to you this evening to the Kelucharan Mohapatra Memorial Lecture, jointly organized by the Raza Foundtion and the India Habitat Center. Before we start the lecture itself, let me tell you, it's very difficult to get articulate speakers on dance. That is one area in which we go from pillar to post. Everybody turns out to be a pillar, but pillar who doesn't speak or not willing to speak. So we have a huge problem finding speakers. But we persist. And sometimes, now SADANAND MENON is featuring in our annual memorial lecture series a second time, which is a very rare distinction. You may say a certain amount of indulgence on our part. He was the first speaker in our Habib Tanveer Memorial Lecture, and now he is going to speak. The audience here does not need to be told about SADANAND MENON. There are very few in this country, and I speak because the country wants to know. There are very few speakers who can speak so eloquently about performing arts with a degree of passion and freshness that SADANAND MENON has, and with social concerns, a cultural vision which is deeply democratic, however, time and again disturbs those who are ensconced in classical comfort to look at the reality outside, to respond to it in some meaningful and creative manner. So SADANAND MENON, we are very grateful he agreed. And if we don't find speakers in the next few years, we will come back to you again. There's no harm in your coming back again and giving us some fresh insights into this practice called dance. So, may I ask you, but before the lecture starts, there is a short film, audiovisual, made by the well-known photographer of the classical forms, Avinash Pasricha. As you know, he had a repertoire of photographs, a large number of them, and he has been wanting to put together into an audiovisual for a long time. Luckily, the Raza Foundation was able to come into the picture, as we keep on coming into the picture whether you like it or not. So we have been able to promote it. So we'll first see the film, and then you will suffer SADANAND MENON. Before that, see the film.
Kelu Babu, as the great Padma Vibhushan Guru Kelucharan Mohapatra was respectfully called by audiences and students around the world, was one of the most distinguished figures of the past century in the revival of classical Indian performing arts. Born near Puri and the sea in village Raghurajpur, renowned for its Pattachitra painting tradition and Gotipua troupe, little Kelucharan Mohapatra learned Gotipua dance, one of the foundations of classical Odissi, still performed by young boys dressed as girls. His father then sent him to a respected Raslila theatre troupe where he apprenticed for 12 years, gaining invaluable hands-on experience in backstage technical work, learnt tabla and performed as a child actor. After working for a year as a beetle leaf cultivator, he got a job as a drummer with Odisha theatres in Cuttack, and eventually his insatiable urge to dance was discovered by Guru Pankaj Charandas, who included some dance in every theatre production. After this, there was no looking back as he embarked on a lifelong process exploring the Mahari temple dance and Gotipua public art traditions of Odisha, folk forms, Shastric texts, temple sculpture and paintings with a genius for examining new material and understanding its aesthetic possibilities and dimensions. All this combined in his remarkable ability to synthesize the many visual and performing art skills to translate the Odissi dance tradition from public square to concert stage.
To create a role on stage is a total involvement. Before coming to the stage, I put on my makeup and begin to focus on the role or character, salute my God and Guru, and only think of what that character will do. I am already transformed before I enter the stage. You have to forget yourself, your own identity totally. If anything unexpected happens on stage, I improvise in character.
Guru Kelucharan Mohapatra embodied the transformational metaphysical possibilities and realities inherent in classical Indian dance. When he entered, the stage became a sacred space. His sinuous lines and perfect proportions created a breathtaking aesthetic, enthralling us all. Very different from the humble, slight man off stage, balding and even with missing teeth. No female disciple could be as enchanting as his Radha in the Gita Govinda, or any other dancer approach the impact of his powerfully moving devotional Kevat Prasad, the boatman of the Ramayana. He captivated audiences in India and around the world with magical interpretations of an inner world of spiritual beauty and truth. Festivals in England, Russia, Germany, France, America and Japan featured Kelu Babu as a living treasure of India. When Kelu Babu joined the Annapurna theatre group, the dancing of Lakshmi Priya, the first Oriya woman to perform on stage, inspired him. Soon, his dancing partner became his cherished life partner. In their homes in Cuttack and Bhubaneswar, the puja room was central, a focus for the religious and spiritual impetus at the heart of his dance and creative energy. Kelu Babu was also amazing at putting things together, taking them apart, reassembling them and recreating, whether cameras, tape recorders or elements of creating a dance piece. Kuri Dela creative artistry to everything, from the masonry of his home, piano playing, to the elegance of churning butter in life and art. From creating a shrine to his beloved mother in Raghurajpur to teaching his art to his granddaughter Pritisha, Kelucharan was devoted to his family. Much of the standard repertoire of modern-day Odissi was created by Guru Kelucharan Mohapatra over the more than 15 years of teaching at the Kala Vikas Kendra, Cuttack from 1953. He had a remarkable ability to teach a relatively large number of students, systematically and precisely, with a pedagogy that constantly evolved. He was large-hearted as a guru and taught his great art to many students across India and the world, as he trusted that the best would nurture and sustain it. During summer courses in the 70s, Guruji would even accommodate students in his own home. From Cuttack to annual workshops in Kolkata, Mumbai and Delhi, as well as internationally, the jet-set Guru finally made Bhubaneswar his base. First with the Odissi Research Center, and then his own institution, Sruja. The pantheon of Odissi dancers, trained by Guru Kelucharan Mohapatra, have shared the flowering of his art and added their own blooms to the garden. In the 70s, Guruji patiently painted the altar and applied makeup mixed from dry pigment for every disciple in his dance drama performances in Odisha. He guided his disciples in every aspect of their lives when needed, as his paternal mentoring and generosity went way beyond just teaching technique. Today, his many disciples share the inheritance of this intangible cultural treasure of Odissi. Each has contributed to the appreciation of this beautiful style of Odissi and added their own artistic creativity to continue to move the tradition forward. Interactions on and off stage with other legendary performing artists, including duets with Kalanidhi Narayanan, Birju Maharaj and Girija Devi, created a lasting impact on all those fortunate enough to be present. His many disciples gathered to celebrate him, as even those not taught by him called him Guruji and felt the same love and affection. In 1966, Odissi dance itself and Guru Kelucharan Mohapatra were honoured with the Central Sangeet Natak Academy Award. His many honours include the Madhya Pradesh government's Kalidas Award in 1987, the Legion of Honour from France, and the 3 Padmas from the President of India, Padma Shri, Padma Bhushan, and the Padma Vibhushan.
In 1995, I was performing at the open air theatre at Sanskriti Kendra. While I was performing Pasyati Disi Disi, the electricity went off. I indicated to my son Shibu to continue playing pavas, and I moved into the audience searching for Krishna by the light of the moon and continued to dance. By the time the lights came back on, and I completed the performance. I had danced 1.5 hours of this single Ashtapadi. Amjad Ali Khan and wife Subhalakshmi genuinely asked if I had composed the performance this way, but I danced from my inner feeling and continued without caring about lights or time.
Over his long career, Guru Kelucharan Mohapatra choreographed literally hundreds of solo compositions, 50 ballets, and inspired hundreds of disciples. His performances enthralled audiences in villages, temples, and capital cities around the globe. Kelubabu's personal genius as an artist, coupled with ceaseless hard work, openness to challenges, to experiment, and the memory of his creativity and affection will continue to delight and inspire as we remember him and renew our dedication to respectfully follow in his footsteps. He was both the architect of the neoclassical revival of Odissi and the guru of most of the leading exponents of this art in the 20th century. The stage was transformed into a sacred space when this humble man set foot upon it. His superlatively moving performances, suffused with devotion and artistic dedication, made him a living legend. We saw the divine on stage, and his deeply felt spiritual and aesthetic offering at the lotus feet of Lord Jagannath continues to reward us with his darshan.
Also mention that one of the first films made on Guru Kelucharan Mohapatra was by Kumar Shani, who is sitting here in the audience. So, let dance be democratized or democracy be dance.
Setting of the tone and this reminiscence of this extraordinary personality and artist. At the risk of being slightly repetitive, I also want to begin with a small clip from a film that was made in the year 1988. So that's a half an hour long film, it's slightly old. There are no copies of it available. There is no, it's a 35mm film called Sahaja, which was made for the women's exhibition in connection with the Festival of India in Russia. And the concluding section of it, which was conceptualized and created by the dancer Chandralekha, was to be on the idea of male-female unity, symbolized through male dancers who perform female roles. And the film was directed by the extraordinary filmmaker from Kerala called Aravindan, It had some outstanding cinematographers who shot it, Shaji Karun and Sunny Joseph and so on, who have gone on to become very big names. They were kids at that time. And the film then went to Russia as part of this exhibition. And what I have to say today, the subject of my talk, is kind of hinged on that experience and what happened to the film. It's a film with about half a dozen dancers, which includes Kelucharan. There's also Vedantam Satyanarayana Sarma, the great Kuchipudi guru and performer, and so on. There are many people in it, but I'll just show that little portion and then talk about why what I'm going to say today is linked to that episode. But it's also interesting that while I have titled the lecture today as Dancing Democracy, I find that many friends have tweeted this and put this on Facebook in very many avatars. Somebody's called it Dance in Democracy. Somebody has called it Dancers Democracy, and so on and so forth. So it's very interesting that there seems to be some problem in sort of arriving at this, the meaning of this idea of dancing democracy. So we'll also negotiate that as we go along. Meanwhile, we'll begin with the film. Rahul, can you please start the volume for the portion is a translation in Russian. so I stopped it. Sorry for the Rasabhanga, but this is of course one of the difficulties of showing what are called archival films made 31 years ago. The original 35mm print lost. The only extant copy was a VHS recording from a Doordarshan telecast that I had taken, and which was completely fungus laden by the time it was cleaned up and sort of put into this shape. And it has therefore all the limitations of, it doesn't give you the comfort of seeing, nice cosmetic, lush kind of screen image, but I think it gives you a story. Now, I don't remember who the singer here was. Either it was Kelucharan Mohapatra or it was Jhelam Pranchme, but when the film was being shot in Chennai, where where Chandralekha lived, and it was shot in her compound, in her theatre. Sangeeta had come, Jhelam Pranchpe had come, Ilyana Chitrasti, they were all students of Kelucharan. They were all there helping him from putting the button on his kurta to removing the kurta. Everything he was being assisted by a bevy of very, very wonderful students he had. And Aravindan, who was living those days, staying in the Woodlands Hotel, would every day bring a carrier of full of food for him from the hotel. And it was that kind of a very informal kind of context within which it was filmed. Kelu Babu, I remember, did the Mardal recording first. He sat separately, the entire Mardal pieces were done by him. Then he coached the vocalist to sort of repeat the avartans that were required for it, etc., etc. And then the shooting happened. The full piece has been recorded. This is hardly a 6-minute clip in the film itself, but the full piece has been recorded. He went on for almost I think 40 minutes with it. Many repeated avartanas, but like I said, it's a lost story. The material is lost. Anyway, this film was technically produced by the Department of Women and Child Welfare, which was at that time under the Human Resource Development Ministry. The Human Resource Development Minister was Sri P.V. Narasimha Rao, who later on went on to become PM. The Women and Child Development Minister was Margaret Alba. ICCR was then headed by Lalit Man Singh. The ICCR secretary was a very powerful lady called Veena Sikri, who later became ambassador, etc. The Human Resource Development Secretary was, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Neena Gupta, etc., etc. So now, it's a film that is being produced for an exhibition on Indian women that will be opened in Moscow, a month-long exhibition, very high-power intergovernmental agreement, etc., etc. The opening must be done by Raza Foundtion. Gorbachev was the president then. So there was this thing that, and this is not a situation of today, even 31 years ago, there was this thing that it should be cleared by the bureaucrat. Somebody has to clear it, somebody has to take the call if something goes wrong in it. We don't know much about this dance, we don't know who this guy is who's performing, we don't know what the content of the song is. We need to be cleared by somebody. So first the secretaries came and watched the film at a preview theatre in Chennai, and they talked among each other, and Ashok should know this whole story. This is how it happens in government. And they were not sure what to do, so they told Arvindan, we have to get the minister. So Arvind was furious. He said, what nonsense, I'm not going to clear this film. What do bureaucrats know, what do ministers know about this kind of thing? So anyway, the exhibition had to happen and the film needed to be cleared. So a week later, both Narasimha Rao and Margaret Rao arrived in Chennai. They saw the film. After the film was projected, the whole half-an-hour long film, Narasimha Rao stood up. There were about 7, 8 of us in the preview theatre. Narasimha stood up, faced everybody and started applauding. And he said, this film, after the exhibition is over, should come back to India and should be shown in every school so that every school student understands the power of our culture and what a fantastic thing, male performers doing female roles, this transition from male to female, this breaking of chivalry. He went on, he was a Sanskrit scholar, he spoke a lot of Sanskrit shlokas and he was pretty excited. So the secretaries didn't know what to do, they agreed, Margaret Alba agreed, and the film went to Moscow. On the inaugural day, before the inauguration, a certain gentleman who was the ambassador of India in Moscow wanted to have a preview. This certain gentleman was very well known in Delhi. His name was T.M. Kaul, one of those great super bureaucrats of that time. So Kaulji saw the film and he expostulated. He said, this cannot be shown in Moscow. This film does not represent India. ये सब क्या है? हिजड़े लोग हैं। ये हिजड़े लोग को मॉस्को में क्यों लेके आए हो? हम हिजड़े नहीं हैं, हम अर्धनारी नहीं हैं, हम पूरे मर्द हैं। 1988, famous words. I still hear the echoes of that kind of language today. I mean, nothing much has changed, so it's a repeat show that's happening all over. But then he began a battle with this delegation of about 14 women activists who had gone with, and artists who had gone with Chandra to Moscow to be part of that exhibition. And they battled for, I think, 2.5 weeks. The exhibition itself was to be for 4 weeks. For 2.5 weeks, every day there was this harassment that this film should be taken off and it should not be shown. It does not represent India. It represents completely debased culture of India, etc., etc. It was said in as many words. And I'm saying this because I wrote 4 articles on this in the Sunday Observer. Those is every week, one front page article up here on this battle that was going on in Moscow. And finally, Kaul succeeded because he stopped the lifeline that was needed for all these Indians who were in part of the exhibition who were in Moscow. They needed a lot of support from the Indian embassy for various things they had to do on a daily basis. So eventually the group decided to come back to India, and the exhibition continued for the next 1.5 weeks. In the same section, titled Ardhanarishwara, they showed a film on Mrs. Gandhi, made by this great cinematographer N.B.K. Murthy, but nevertheless, this was the irony of the situation.
It did not last at all.
But when Chandra came back here to Delhi, there was a press conference at the press club, and she became very popular with the local media because she said, Mr. Kaul seems to be an oddity because he claims he's pura marad. And even science tells us that male-female differentiation is just a 1% differentiation between 49% X and 51% Y. And this pura marad is a complete nonsense. Nobody is 100% Y or X. So it's that 1% difference that creates millions of shades of masculinity or femininity. And she, along with other feminists like Vibhuti Patel, etc., so they had a very strong press conference here, and the press took it up in a big way. The long and short of it, the exhibition the idea was it would come back after that 1 month in Moscow and be traveled and toured in India, but that never happened. The film itself got lost. Arvindan had a dupe negative in Prasad Lab. So he was again so furious with this whole development that he decided that he had to take it to the full length. So he got the Prasad Lab guys to make another positive out of it, which was sent as an entry to the documentary film festival that was happening in Hyderabad that year, the India National Documentary Film Festival. And lo and behold, it got the Best Documentary Award there. And 3 months later was the opening of the festival in Tokyo, in Japan. And lo and behold, who was the guest of honor opening performer? Kelucharan Mohapatra. So this for me is a story which is linked to the perils of what we understand as democracy here, or rather the precariousness of the idea of democracy here. The tenuous and fragile relationship between expression and control. Sometimes the tension is between individual expression and control, and sometimes it's between collective expression and control, as of course we are seeing now in Kashmir or Assam or whatever. The idea of control is almost built into the DNA of the idea of Indian democracy. So how does art function in an atmosphere of sanctions and censorship? Some of them are official, some of them come from more social spaces. But today I want to reflect a bit, not with respect to specific governmental modes, this government, that government, etc., etc. But I'm keener to look at the larger issue of the role of the state in all this. How does the state behave in these kind of situations? I have personally imagined democracy more as a form of accountability rather than as a form of representation. For me, it is a system within which any kind of questioning of those who govern in my name is valid and legitimate. Or, as the American political philosopher Cornel West never tires of saying, democracy, more than a form of governance, is a way of being in the world. Experimental, improvisational, jazz-like. It is a system in which even the person on the last outpost matters and has a voice. However, at a time when democracy in India seems to have become a term well on the way to being evoked in the past tense, I was trying to imagine if that concept or something akin to it could be located in any of our historically expressive forms. Performative forms where individuality and collectivity coexist as a structural feature of the community. In other words, is the notion of liberal democracy an integral feature of the DNA of our society? Because if it is merely a Western import, overlaid on social structures that are by temperament hierarchical and autocratic, rather than democratic, then a different kind of political process and revolution will be needed to make democracy effective on our soil. While our classical forms are certainly exclusionary, and this needs to be emphasized again and again, the exclusionary nature of the classical forms, which lives in an ivory tower, which lives in a shibboleth, which doesn't want to get its hands dirty, is certainly a problem. But we do have evidences of Adivasi and folk forms, enough of it, that are participatory and improvisational, which succeed in celebrating the individual even within the labor of the collective. I'm thinking of, and many of you in Delhi would have seen this during the Republic Day parades, the Ghumar, the Garba, the Bhangra, the Parayatam, the Kaiko Tikkali, the Nacha, and many such others, which are examples of collective behavior. They accommodate, they are circular construct, precluding the possibility of spatial hierarchy. They accommodate structural asymmetry and individual breakouts. They privilege voluntarism over control and centralization. They celebrate the idea of democracy as an exercise in holding hands and performing in order to generate what Slavoj Žižek has so brilliantly called a surplus of enjoyment. At the same time, what they reject is the idea of democracy as the arrogance of power. These Adivasi and folk forms are choreographed to discourage the urge for domination and control. Recent political events in India convince one to suggest that the democratic process here would need to dig deep and invest in learning much needed lessons from the existing cultural forms around us as a check and balance against muscular megalomania. But this brings us to reflect a bit deeper on the quasi-ontological relation between art and politics itself. A useful concept contributed in recent times within this discourse is the concept of dissensus by the French philosopher Jacques Rancière, which applies equally to art and politics, as it is tied to dissident processes leading to the rupture of daily habits, perceptual disjunctions, eccentric movements in language and behavioral cliches. Dissensus becomes the very core of the aesthetic regime, even as it energizes the resistance to political control. It then also becomes the core of a democratic way of being and thinking, where the citizen constantly upgrades herself by a continuous refinement of the idea of freedom. In older societies like India, this is often achieved by the carnivalesque, by utsavs, melas, purams, and so on. Apart from being linked to cycles of production, distribution, and circulation, as well as seasonal and ritual demands, these collective events provide a specific ambience for amusement and entertainment, so much needed for letting off steam in a social context. They help break the monotony of daily routine and work and create a counterpoint to a life of travail. And most importantly, they introduce into a world of given, fixed normality the experience of negativity, otherness, abnormality. This negativity, or dissensus we call it, is a powerful social mechanism as it helps to pose before society positively the image of its own underside as well as creative potential. The traditional utsavs and melas integrate into the entire residual flakes of the culture which would not normally fit in anywhere else. Being people's celebrations, these constitute the meeting place of types not easily socialized. Mendicants and quacks, soothsayers and conmen, acrobats and wrestlers, snake charmers and dealers in aphrodisiacs, prostitutes and performers, craftsmen and balladeers, a talented, floating, quasi-criminal, marginalized population of the social fringes, even the acceptance of whose existence is embarrassing for the elite and for the state. Conversely, for those not shackled by middle-class morality, these are occasions for the suspension of ordinary rules of behavior and an entry into the realm of the sexual and the irrational. We have about 40 kilometers outside of Chennai, an annual festival that happens is called the Aravani Festival, which is entirely a festival of the transgender communities, and literally hundreds and thousands of people come there. The police never go anywhere near there. It's a two-day, two-night festival. The police simply keep away because they know the problems of getting anywhere close there. And there have been some very interesting documentaries made on this festival and the sort of social relations it produces, which I'm sure if it were shown in public spaces, these films, to a larger number of audiences, there's going to be some kind of an uproar. Melas and utsavs denote the repressed side of society's consciousness, as for example, once again, you got to see with the novel of Perumal Murugan, the Madhuru Bhagam novel, where a social practice, living social practice of childless women going to temples on a particular night, and if a child is produced after that through interaction with the opposite sex, it is considered a gift of the god and so on. These are part of something that the mainstream society would not like to acknowledge, but it exists in every corner and nook and corner of this country that exists. The Naga Baba exist everywhere with all kinds of mysterious sexual practices and mysterious physical practices, which mainstream culture is loath to acknowledge, or is in fact fearful of acknowledging. So Melas and Utsavs denote the repressed side of society's consciousness, a side which returns with fixed regularity to haunt established culture with all it does not want to acknowledge about itself. The reason for bringing this point up here is twofold. This is a feature of older societies that modern day democracies have failed to understand or emulate or integrate. The only festival modern India has been able to give itself is obviously the Republic Day parade, or the similarly politicized propagandistic events like the Commonwealth Games inaugurals and so on, which lack an open-ended character of the traditional experience and has an embarrassed relationship with otherness. By policing, liberating deviance and asserting authoritarian prudery, by liberating deviance, I mean, for example, you saw in the film the Dalit farm laborer, landless laborer, who transforms into a Deivam, a god, and for that period of 48 hours has full sacred control over that village community, including the landlords who flog him every day, including the moneylenders who make his life miserable, and so on. But for those 48 hours, this person gets the vent necessary to speak back to society. And I'm not saying it works all the time, but it's a system, it's a mechanism that society has given itself. But we find increasingly in modern democracies, these spaces getting closed. By policing, liberating deviance and asserting authoritarian prudery, these get reduced to spectacles that deny negativity and dissensus and merely reproduce the exploitative attitude of the dominant culture. The other reason for bringing this up is because here is where we begin to seek the relation between dance and democracy. The move for political democracy in India, beginning in the late 19th century, and is very interesting, was parallelly accompanied by the move to dominate and tame and sanitize the dancer's body. Indian freedom in 1947, August 1947, was accompanied in October 1947 by the Devadasi Abolition Act and the invisibilization of an entire community of performing artists. It mirrors what we are doing to 8 million Kashmiris today, over 2 million Assamese today, or people in Assam, and more such erasures are in the pipeline. It is a negativity or dissensus that our democracy has not been able to sustain. The history of the reinvention of Indian dance in the early decades of the 20th century has been a history of willful obfuscation and falsification of the entire narrative of how the organic and authentic physical practices of the communities of Devadasis were appropriated by the upwardly mobile upper castes, and a counterfeit narrative of recuperation and tradition was inserted in its place. It led to the disenfranchisement of the organic processes of the vast treasures of physical knowledge and musical knowledge, and a progressive cosmeticization of the dance body, leading to serious questions about the dishonesty of contemporary dance history. All the primary Indian dance forms originating in primitive and tribal societies are solidly linked with work activity. They were intimately related to functions of daily life like food gathering, hunting, fishing, cultivating and harvesting. The early tribal dances were particularly distinguished by their sources in rituals, gymnastics, and martial arts. Dancing in these early communities was a means of expression as well as a method of building up energy circuits within the body and sharpening the senses. We are fortunate in having a material subculture in India that simultaneously retains forms of expression spanning several stages of the development of Indian society. In tribal belts, for example, one still sees forms of dance that are clearly modes of an elaborate attack-defense ritual used primarily for creating in its participants the necessary energy for a confrontation. The regional variations of the martial dance are amazing for their grace and for their potential to generate militancy as well. The militancy of dance forms in India, which remain popular even today, is supplemented by the fact that even the classical dance forms, despite idealizing their content, have not been able to shed the martial and gymnastic poses of the early forms from which they originate. And this was a major point that dancer Chandrulekha made from the beginning of her return to dance somewhere in the early 80s, and led to her integrating the martial art forms like Kalaripayat, etc. into her work with Bharatanatyam dancers, and in a sense literally changed the physicality of the dancers. And if one sees recordings of work over a period of time, you see that transition. The same dancer who was performing say at the Festival of India in Moscow in 1988, by the time it is 1998, that same dancer's body has changed so interestingly and so pointedly that it makes you wonder why dance schools do not think seriously about integrating some of these issues. Historically, of course, there exist testimonies of how collective dance practices through direct energizing of the masses were believed to have led to actual revolutionary movements. So the question legitimately arises, what can dance contribute to the notion of democracy and the political? Considering dance can be a means by which mobilization is accomplished. The self-mobilization of subjectivity inherent to modernity, for example, situates choreography at the very core of modernity's massive project of subjectivation. This invites us to reflect on the relation of dance to power. We have already seen how mass dances are spectacles of nationhood. Susan Sontag in Fascinating Fascism has provided us a grim portent of the political effects of mass spectacles of the kind that were filmed by Leni Riefenstahl in Berlin in the 1930s. The availability of new technology only enhances this power to frightening levels. It becomes the new means of colonizing individual bodies. Thus, if choreography is a controlled organization of bodies in space, often coaxing it to merge itself with the normative body of the state, the idea of democracy has to perform the opposite task of resisting such statist interventions and enabling the body to retain its autonomy and dance a democracy into shape. I have often said that if we take the classical forms of dance, their principal conceptualization of the body was of an idealized body. Everything is perfect, whether it's a ballet, whether it's Bharatanatyam, whether it's Odissi, whether it's Kathak. There's an idealization of the body and an attempt to make it non-human, maybe invested with some divine idea, etc., etc. And in opposition to that, when modern dance emerges in the early parts of the 20th century, it chooses to oppose this idea by, in one sense, positing the brutalization of the body. Contemporary dance is an example of that, where you don't even mind hurting the body. You bang against a wall, those famous early Astad Debu performances of with syringes getting into his body and slashing with the blade, and fairly well-known experiments with many German dancers who do this kind of sort of a physical penance, if you want, or a self-torture or a self-flagellation publicly. So then, the direction of dance has to be between that, between idealization and brutalization, which probably can be conceptualized as humanization, a humanization of the body, to accept the body for what it is and acknowledge it, and not to give it some supernatural status, not to give it some victimized status, to recover that space that is in between. So under this thought, democratic politics is whatever shifts a body from the place assigned to it or changes a place's destination. Somewhat in the manner of what we saw Kelucharan do in Kelucharan, where everything is shifted. The gender is shifted, the location is shifted, the aesthetics is shifted. There's an amazing shift that is happening there, where even without wanting to, even without knowing it, we are seeing a bald man in his 60s, frail, with pockmarks on his face, getting transformed in front of our eyes into this very beautiful apparition, who some kind of a sexualized ideal. But that transition happens in a manner that is sahaj. It is like you enter that space without any restraint. The same sequence has been shot in Kumar's film in Bhavantaran also. Kelucharan doing a completely different rendition of Kelucharan Nandan, and again very beautiful, again very provocative, and so on. So what this does is it makes visible what had no business being seen. It makes heard and understood as discourse what was heard before only as noise. And that's the power of this shift that happens in the aesthetic realm. Dance and the political are thus linked by their emphasis on performance as something totally contingent. Dancing democracy then becomes an invitation to discard the agglomerations of normatives that regulate the public affairs of a state's citizens, and instead to view both dance and democracy as a field of experimentation and mobilization of the possibility for the unforeseen to happen, which is another way of saying to assert freedom. And for me, this is what I would, in one sense, hope to see in dance practice in our midst, to be confronted again and again with the idea of the unforeseen. But instead what you get is what you already know. I have no problem with repetition. A raga can be repeated and a taan can be repeated multiple times, and each time it's a new avartan, it's a completely new idea that's being created. But somehow in the dance practice that seems to have solidified into a set number of repetitions which mean the same every time, without opening up the possibility of a little change in nuance. And I'm sure you know this, the best political dance we have seen perhaps is Charlie Chaplin, his adorable dance with the globe in his 1940 masterpiece, The Great Dictator, where the globe is what can be lightly tossed between the fascist's palms, and bumped with his rump before it bursts under the weight of his desire to dominate. Almost 8 decades later, many of us must be pardoned for our sense of dismay as the contemporary forces of globalization make such an eventuality a distinct threat. In the era of the neoliberal cult of both performance and democracy, which reduces sensible matter in politics to exploitable resource as commodity, dance and democracy can only matter as affirmative counteracts, reaffirming the political of the dissensus, the need for new resilient bodies, as well as the alteration and the invention of new transformative rhythms. So I am leaving you with that thought. I thank Raza Foundation and Ashok and all my colleagues here for providing this opportunity. Yes, sir.
Well, friends, there's some time for questions and brief comments.
Yes, sir.
We had heard a rather serious lecture, and therefore some time for humor and wit. After all, democracy cannot survive by seriousness. We have too many. So, yes?
You have a mic?
Just a minute. It'll come to you.
Okay. Don't mind my bringing this issue up because it might end up seeming as though I disagree with you. I probably will. I like very much the way you... My name is Bohidar, Natarajan Bohidar, and I'm in Odia. And I run an initiative that I call Democracy Within a Continuum, which is the position that I seek for India. I like the way you very carefully evaded the two important words in most of the dance that we do, as God and religion. I think you avoid the two of them because you try to see the socialization or the secularization of dance and how that could be. The important point in Kelu Babu's work, I think, is that he's trying to express a dichotomy. One is that I can go and reach God without an intermediary. I understand you wrote some large pieces about the Russian piece in Sunday Observer. You know, the media is not important to me. I don't have to learn from a medium to take me to God. And that's very important in his work. And God is not male and God is not female because God shows himself as a single cellular which later got divided in the evolutionary process. And yet, the Guru Shishya Parampara tells us that the control on art, the control on dance, the dictatorial control in theatre, the backdrop and the work that happens behind is enormous. So we have this strange dichotomy of, I don't need you, I can get to God myself, and yet I'm expressing mudras, etc., which I've learned with great practice for many years. I thought perhaps you'd like to dwell on that a bit, unless I think you're a little bit of a leftist, so you don't want to get into God.
I'm not a little bit of a leftist, I'm quite large.
No wonder. Yeah, I got the sense, yeah.
But that is hardly the point. I think this introduction of the word God is into this set of practices which we call dance or which we call performance is rather unfortunate, and it's a very recent contribution. Some of the dances I mentioned, or even where Kelu was born, Avinash lovely pictures of Raghurajpur, where you go and see the Kotupuas performing, they don't talk about God. They talk about male-female unity, Manosomana, let's get together. God is a conceit that has come into Indian dancers discourse around the time when the Indian national movement discovered the importance of working with cultural forms. And a kind of a splitting happens between the classical and the rest. And we call it folk, we call it this, we call it that, but the classical kind of stands apart. Now, how do you distinguish the classical from this? Many of the movement repertoire and vocabulary of the classical is coming from the folk forms only, or the Adivasi forms. So this invention of a god, a book, and a religion happens almost in front of our eyes. Just like the reinvention of Bharatanatyam happens in the 1920s, and the reinvention of Odissi happens in the 1950s, and so on. So these are all new things. This is not some ancient stuff. But we now know, if I'm an aspirant dance student, I know that all dance began with Shiva dancing on Kailasha as Nataraja. And Bharata Muni was a witness to that. He was one of our earliest journalists, earliest reporters. And he sat and faithfully wrote down this tome. And it comes down. And those who practiced from that tome were the Apsaras. The first ones to learn was Ramba, Urvashi, Tilottama, etc., etc. So now, when I go on stage, I'm a representative of those Apsaras. I'm an Apsara myself. I'm receiving divine sanction, divine grace, divine lineage. So your job is to come with a worshipful attitude, sit there, watch me dance, I've seen divinity, and go back. No critical attitude necessary. It's fine, it's poetry, it's very nice, one can gush over it a little bit on an indulgent moment. I think you need to get a bit serious about what is this thing doing in India in the present moment. What is this form that is so anti-democratic, so feudal, so disconnected with our times and our people? What is it doing?
You mean democracy?
No, I mean classical dance. What you were highlighting. Anyway, so this can be a debate. I think if you have a question, then I'll answer it.
Okay, so I'll close by just one word. I also do an initiative called Tri-Urbanity, which is tribal, rural, and urban continuum.
Okay.
And it's circularity, which you talked about. So we'll talk about that later, and how it works.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Oh, my friend Anantagiri is here.
He never goes to a lecture without asking a question. Yes, go ahead.
Anantagiri is a professor at the MIDS in Chennai. Yes.
Thank you so much, SADANAND, for your very deep journey. Now, in terms of performance, as you very rightly mentioned, that it is related to contingency, and that contingency is not just reproduction. It is in that same light we can take it further, and that performance as a space and time of realization of potential. So, agreeing with you, we can deepen that journey of the performative. And that performative also can be cultivated at the individual societal level. Therefore, dancing democracy, what kind of cultivation of the performative that we can do? And my second quick query is, the deep significance of your work is that
Significance
of your lecture is rethinking subjectivity. Because while the dominant discourse of subjectivity has made it an adjunct to power, and that to the dominant power, the subjectivity that you are presenting is a critique of that. Therefore, that subjective issue, which is not a slave to power, but finally, it is also a reconstitution of the discourse and practice of power. You have suggested that. So if you could elaborate a little bit, what would be an alternative vision of power, both at the individual and societal level, which is not linked to a tendency of aggression and domination?
Yeah, very large question, Giri. I'll have to do another lecture on that possibly. But shortly, the only response is that as a society, we need to try and figure out what to do with this idea of beauty. I mean, we respond to all this because somewhere deep down we also feel it's beautiful. Kelu Babu we cannot dismiss. He's beautiful. He's beautiful as a person, beautiful as a performer. The content of his work is beautiful. It has echoes of the past, It has echoes of something that is probably left behind, so echoes of something that is maybe archaic. But he was also able to be absolutely contemporary in the way he reaches out and touches you. And this is true for any performer that, of that stature that you come across, the old gurus, for example. And I'm actually very grateful to someone like Sunil Kothari, who virtually holds your hand and takes you to various gurus and says, look at him, look at him, look at him. Because normally one tends to say, no, this is all old, old stuff, and why should one bother? But then it's only when you see Aman or Madhavacharya perform Bali Vadam, my God, it's like seeing a absolutely modern interpretation of Oedipus or something. It's absolutely brilliant contemporaneity in it. So now, what do we do with this material that one would like to just call beautiful? Does one put it up on a pedestal and worship it? Does one put it in a museum and say, aha, once in a while you go and you applaud and come back? Or does one find a passage by which that world and the world of the not so beautiful, the rough and tumble, can somewhere find a link and in one sense seed each other? The rough and tumble should move into that dance world, and that aesthetic world should move into the rough and tumble. I'm not saying should is a bad word, but a possibility of that exchange, a possibility of where things are not isolated and insulated into kind of impeccable units. So, and this is why one would like to bring the issue of dance up front with the issue of democracy. Because I think only a democratic regime a real democratic regime can make this possible. And to the extent that it is not happening, to that extent we are also a flawed democracy. And this you can extend to many forms. I mean, dance is maybe a narrow universe, but it's an example of how a possibility is being lost. And much blame can be laid at the feet of the way cultural institutions developed in India from the post-independence period. The kind of academies we created, the kind of patronages we created, and so on and so forth, which has not understood any of this. It's just got bureaucratized. And I've always wondered, why is it not possible for artists to sort of move? I mean, one of the first secretaries of Sangeet Natak Academy was Uday Shankar. Now, why couldn't Uday Shankar, with all the fantastic vision he had and the amazing film Kalpana he made and so on and so forth, and all the tremendous accumulation of primitive material, just watching everything, and he was not just a local figure, he was an international figure. What prevented him from reconceptualizing a completely different kind of Sangeet Natak Academy? What prevented it? And it's very clear, therefore, that for me, right from the beginning, our democracy was not a democracy. It was not going to allow it. It was not going to allow these hijras, these prostitutes. I mean, till the 1940s, maybe till the 50s, if you were a dancer, you were a prostitute. No two questions about it. No way we are going to enable them to come on top in this culture. We'll keep them in their place. Yeah, we'll give them some grant, we'll give them a festival, we'll give them a performance, we'll keep. So this, to the extent that Indian society did not speak back to this attitude, to that extent our democracy got enfeebled. And that's I think major area that needs to be looked into. I have not come across any particular research work in this at this juncture.
Yes. And there are no more questions or comments?
I can go on addendum, but we can take it later.
Take it later.
Addendum.
Well, friends, you would agree that what SADANAND did this evening vindicates in more than one way our choice to feature him a second time in our memorial lecture series. Thank you very much. while the new month starts from tomorrow, starts a series of activities that we'll be organizing. The first one is a poetry reading on the 4th in IICNX of young Hindi poets. On November 6th, we have Aram, some of you know, which introduces young classical dancers and musicians. On November 8th, we have Gandhi Matters in IIC again, Victory of the Spirit over Raw Power, Václav Havel's Lessons from Mahatma Gandhi. We will have another lecture in this annual memorial series on November 28th, the Daya Krishna Memorial Lecture, Can We Afford Not to Be Secular by Professor Rajiv Bhargav. So you'll get this information anyway, and do please find time to come in spite of everything, in spite of the pollution, the traffic jams, and some other unnecessary businesses. Thank you.
And an unachievable policy.